Today's session is focused on how we go about WFM, workforce management implementations, as part of a bigger HCM initiative, which includes HR, payroll, and obviously workforce management sits in between. As we go through the different topics today, please feel free to add any questions in the chat box, and we'll address them as we go through the slides. Or if it's a topic that we're going to cover later on, we'll wait and hopefully address it. And if there's still questions, we'll and time at the end, we'll address those at the end. Also, make sure you maximize the window that the presentation is on. If you want to better see the presentation, you could double click on that window and it would open it up to maximize it. It's easier to view that. So with that, let me introduce myself. My name is Alice Garion. I'm a delivery director with Axiom Group. I have over 19 years of experience implementing technology solutions, with the last 15 years purely focused on workforce management implementations and consulting that goes with it. That includes HR, time and attendance, payroll, budgeting, forecasting, schedule optimization, labor standards, and related business intelligence solutions. I also have Pete with me today. Pete Roberts is one of our senior consultants with Axiom. And Pete, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Pete Roberts. I'm a senior consultant with over 20 years experience in a variety of roles, delivering business solutions via customer support, service delivery, and project consulting in Canada, the US, Europe, and Australia as well. The last 10 years I've been with, I think today is my 10-year anniversary. I've been with Axiom, working with predominantly on Infor WFM platforms, doing time and attendance, scheduling in all its different varieties, as well as analytical and business intelligence solutions that go along with that.
Oh, thank you, Pete. So I'm going to start with a little bit of who we are and who Axiom is, and then we're going to talk about some of our current implementations in flight. Axiom Group was founded by ex-WorkBrainers back in 2005, and WorkBrain product is the WFM Infor product today. So WorkBrain was acquired by Infor. I think it was in 2007, but again, our sole mission, and as you heard, Pete Roberts also on the call that is with us. He came from WorkBrain as well. We do have a lot of people coming, from WorkBrain. Our company's sole mission was implementing workforce management and providing consultancy around that. So we're purely focused on workforce management implementations, and we also provide strategic work around workforce management and change management and labor studies, that process improvements that goes. We also have managed services that after these implementations are done, we help our customers maintain and their solutions for. In the past 15 years, we have delivered over 350 implementations around the globe. We are a global company. We have offices in North America, Australia, and UK, and we are the longest tenured Infor partner for WFM implementations. So now that I told you a little bit about, I would like to highlight some of our current WFM implementations in the context of a big HCM implementation. So the ones I'm going to talk about in here, they are truly a HCM implementation, but we are function. HBC, Hudson Bay Company, is one of the largest Canadian retail business groups. They own actually Saks Fifth Avenue, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with that. Vectrus is where Pete today. He's still working on that project. Is a leading provider of global service solutions in the area of information technology and network communication services and logistics services. OneOncology is the healthcare industry. They're based off of Nashville, and then the company kind of brought three brands basically together: Tennessee One Oncology, a New York Blood and Cancer Specialist, and Westchester Center. And by bringing all of those together, basically they have about 200 oncology centers under their business. They're expanding and then they're growing very fast. So that is another project that is ongoing right now. And City of Myrtle Beach, we also have in there, which actually is kind of self-explanatory. We're not going to provide details around that. So with that, I would like to now, Pete, ask you a few questions really around these type of implementations. Based on the complexities and dependencies of these HCM implementations, what do organizations need to be thinking about as it relates to managing the risks and dependencies on these type of projects?
Well, I think the most important thing to do is have a holistic approach. Across HR, WFM, and payroll, this is really critical for success. There's three sort of elements that we've outlined here. The people involved. Make sure that your project governance is aligned for the goals of the project to ensure good quality control, that a program center of excellence is ensuring good quality control as well, and that OCM, or organizational change management, is aligned with this as a good change management plan, and for training and communication to the water company is really key here. When we get into the process, this is the time to review your operations, processes, and other opportunities to standardize where possible. It's critical you get the right subject matter experts engaged here, and you're looking at this from an employee or user perspective. For example, a client I'm working on currently does not have maybe the best defined way this is set up, and it's really had an effect on their project timeline, and the overall cost for rework and out of scope change type control is quite significant. But previous clients that I've worked on had a really good integrated project team implementing all the pieces together, and the benefits are noticeable by comparison. The current people are familiar with the processes that are really essential in these areas. You just can't stress that enough. And then when we get into the technology side, this is all about the new infrastructure. How do you want to implement the software, and what will be needed to maintain the system? And many clients in this area fall into the trap of trying to automate everything. Software is a solution, to be sure, but rare is the solution that accomplishes automating everything. Instead, a balance of technology and human processes is the most common approach for successful use of new technology. It's key to look for opportunities to automate where possible, but not be beholden to automating everything. And do you want to talk about the benefits, Al, or do you want me to?
Yeah, well, that's fine. Great point you made. I just wanted to highlight one thing in there. The key thing here is, and obviously we have the HCM. Usually components are HR, WFM, and payroll, right? And when Pete mentioned process changes, harmonizations, all of that, those not only decisions made within the WFM piece will impact HR, will impact payroll. And having a holistic view, that's what it means. If we are suggesting to harmonize something in the WFM, what is the impact on HR? Now, maybe HR needs to be harmonized on that regard too. And what is the impact on the export, on the outbound of the WFM, which is the payroll, right? So having a holistic view and understanding the decisions made within each of these, whether it's a process change or a design change or other decisions made, looking at it holistically will help us understand those dependencies, understand the impact on others much better, and plan accordingly, right? Also, that's the same thing with project governance and OCM, right? Change management should be across all of these, should not be only looked at just within the WFM work. If you do that, though, if you do this type of alignment across HR, WFM, and payroll around the different disciplines of people, process, and technology, the output of that would be clear goals and metrics that will correctly measure the success of the project, which is across all these three. It's not about one or two, it's about the whole project. That also improves accountability across HR, WFM, and payroll, because usually these are separate teams with different expertise working on different timelines. And also, it does streamline the employee experience because we're looking at it holistically. We're looking at how's the user impacted in HR and then the WFM and then the payroll.
Yep.
Process and technology, obviously, harmonizations across all three. And then last but not least, compliance and quality. So let me ask you one more thing, Pete. Obviously, we talked a lot about how HR, WFM, and payroll work hand in hand to deliver the objectives of the project. But I want us to kind of take a little bit of a kind of a deeper dive into what type of dependencies exist between these three work streams.
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, and you've got the slide there in front of me. So basically, sure, there are project dependencies, and these are what project milestones and deliverables are impacted by other work in progress. Things like when you have an interface that's coming into one, do you have the export interface coming out of the other? And are the deliverables for those aligned so that you can have one seamlessly flow through another? Those are just straight project management type things. But when you get into design dependencies, you got to be thinking about what functionality or processes are dependent on other work, design, or other projects that are in progress. So, is there work going on for a specific functionality in the HR side of things that's going to deliver benefit data into WFM, and is that ready to be brought over? Things like that. And then when you're talking about data dependencies, the question really here is, what do I need in WFM from upstream? And what does WFM data need to go into the downstream S3 or payroll system? And this is really key here. What are your specific data you need of the different systems to flow through?
Got it. And I'm sure that all of these elements we are critical to the success of the project. But one thing came to my mind when you talked about the design dependencies, and I remember that we had so many discussions around accruals, for example, how people earn and accrue their entitlements. That could reside on HR side and also could reside on the WFM side. And the decision as to what is the impact, how should we design this in, what are the design implications and the dependencies between the two, and make the right decision around that. Those are the things that need to be hashed out and discussed early in the project.
Yep, for sure.
So how about we now, I mean, we highlighted these three basically dependencies. How about we take a deeper dive in each of these and kind of give some examples, some real life scenarios, and kind of expand a little bit more on that. So sure. I'm going to start with the project dependencies. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Sure. And with project dependencies, you're really talking about things like alignment of design workshops between different streams, making sure that you have the key stakeholders present and prep for these sessions. Really, like a good example is there's nothing worse than Bob, who's on vacation, who's not available for the work stream discussions around this, and that throws an impact on your timeline. So it's really important to have people in the right place talking about design early on in the project. And then you really have to focus on knowledge transfer between project teams. This is really to ensure that each work stream understands each other's purposes and roles. And it's really, really important key that you don't silo projects. You're not having one group doing one thing over here, and the other hand, you're doing another group doing stuff over there, and they're not talking to each other, because you're going to have issues with that. And it's really important that they're not working independently. There's a conversation going on there. And then really it's important to define the milestone dependencies and align across the projects accordingly. For HR, WFM, and payroll, things like interface design, like what I was talking about, if you don't have the piece to export correctly, it's really hard to design and build the input correctly. So you probably have to build the output before you build the input, and setting up your milestones for the project accordingly. And it's really important for things like system integration testing and end-to-end testing and user acceptance testing that these are holistic across all three platforms. And then the final piece is you want to have the user acceptance testing across all streams concurrently. You can do system integration testing between different pieces at different times, but you really need to do a full user acceptance testing across everything. And this should be scenario-based, based on ensuring everyday processes like hiring, termination, transfers, leave are aligned and flow properly. The other real key thing that you have to consider is what other work is ongoing that impacts this. Payroll people probably are going to have to process payroll every 2 weeks. You have to really factor that into the schedule. And then things like end of year and stuff that's being associated with the current functionality, that takes away from people's time. So you have to factor that in when you're doing a project dependency type.
Planning,
yeah, planning for sure.
Well, yeah, that totally makes sense. And again, I've seen that being a problem on most of the projects where, again, as much as important as it is that we create a schedule that defines all the resources and the needs very well defined for the implementation team of vendor and maybe the consulting partner, it is even more important to ensure that the resource needs or commitment needed from the client side is also hashed out and discussed early in the project. And so we totally understand, because they do have a day job to attend to, and they need to understand what weeks they need to be, more involved and what weeks not. I think I just wanted to also emphasize that the first item in here, the design alignment workshops, I think it's critical that HR, WFM, and payroll experts that are on each of these teams and working within their own work to join the discovery and design sessions for the other ones, right? And that's the thing that you're highlighting in here.
Yeah.
For at least those elements that we know that impact each other, they should be present in those discovery and design discussions. So decisions are not made in silos, assuming, for example, HR can do this, or assuming that payroll can do that, or WFM can do that, based on the assumptions.
Yeah.
Having those right people in there is going to make sure that, decisions are not made in silos and some wrong assumptions are not made, right?
Yeah, and a lot of times I've seen, you've got the HR expert in the WFM conversation, but they're there doing other stuff. They're just in the room. And instead of having to go find them, you just like, hey, we need you for this relevant piece, and just pull them in. So it doesn't have to be, everybody's all meetings all the time. You just got to have that easy access to those people.
Well, that makes sense. Anything else you would like to add on project dependencies, or should we move on to the next one about design dependencies?
Yeah, I mean, just factoring in that people take vacation and things like that, making sure those types of schedules are updated as well. Like there's, people have lives, and you want to make sure that the project doesn't burn them out as well. So that's the only other thing I can really think of there. Yeah, so let's move along to the design dependencies.
Sure thing. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, so design dependencies, this is where we're talking about the things that impact the design from the other pieces. So with GHR, the biggest, or Lawson, or the upstream HR system, we really want to factor in the hierarchy data for WFM. And this really comes into the approval structure. Obviously, the most relevant one for a WFM system is going to be the time card approval and the visibility of reports. But what we tend to find is this tends to be position-based in GHR, whereas WFM relies on who is the approver. So who's the person who's actually validating the working may not be the employee's boss. It's maybe their team leader or whatnot. So you have to factor that into your hierarchy design. And then another big piece is the employee profile data. for WFM functionality. All relevant data for logic in WFM and what needs to be in WFM versus GHR and S3. In the past, we've included things like social security number as a unique identifier, but that's a bit of a no-no in the modern privacy world. So do you really need to have a social security number in WFM? Probably not. But you may need to have a phone number or a birth date for things like calculating, birth date for calculating accruals potentially, but a phone number for can the supervisor reach out to someone in a case when they have to do scheduling. So you need to have a phone number there. So these are the types of things you have to think about what type of employee information needs to be in WFM. And then Al touched on this briefly earlier, but is benefits data for WFM time off workflows, is all the data needed for PTO requests and approvals and in WFM, and what is the system of record and how will this flow through? So what Al earlier was, does this logic need to be in WFM or is it going to be upstream in GHR? That really depends on the complexity of your specific organization and a design decision that's made at that point. But this is a really important thing to consider at that point. When we get into Infor WFM, you have to talk about the team structure for security, reporting, and workflows. Do these align? So I was talking about this briefly before, but who needs to see who in the WFM system? And for what functionality the group needs to have access to? Like I said, is the person's boss their time card approval, but is also the person who is approving their time card, the person who approves their time off requests and their leave requests. So you have to factor in all these things at this point. A lot of times it's the same person, but it may not be. So you have to at least have these questions and conversations. When we're talking about employee setup, it's things like payroll assignments, labor metric visibility, employee data visibility. This is really about ensuring the correct pay logic is applied to groups of employees and what labor metrics end users can use to complete their time cards. For pay calculations, time capture and pay calculation logic, retro adjustment processes, on and off cycle pay processes, pay close attention to the time capture process. This is usually a spot for OCM to be involved as well, as it tends to be a change from an existing system. With employee entitlements and accrued time off logic and employee balance availability, this ties into the employee benefits section above. So not all groups may have PTO, some may have vacation. Do they need to see a PTO balance if they don't have it? These types of questions need to be answered at this point. Which groups see which entitlements or balances? And it's really key to know who your groups of employees are by pay calculations and pay frequencies. This can really allow for some streamlining of the project. A current client that I've worked on had about 60 different contracts, and they went through a streamlining exercise and they turned that into 40 different pay calculation groups. So instead of just taking it, we have this many groups of employees and we need to build it out, they went through an exercise and said, no, these two are similar enough, we can build that together and then and save some time and money as a result of that. When we get into payroll, it's really the data or the design is around balanced usage. And this is thinking about what needs to be done to update the system of record. Do you need an interface update to that system? So if you were to choose to have your HR GHR system that's a system of record for balances, when you send the actuals out into S3, you then have to have a true up back into GHR to update system of record so that the accruals can calculate correctly based on what was used in the last pay period. Another big consideration you want to have is rate application. Do you want to have the rates visible in WFM or just in payroll? It depends really on the organization. A lot of places don't want people to know how much they're making, so they segregate that. They may keep it in WFM, but they don't make it visible because they need it for calculations around pay logic or whatever. But Best practices, if you don't need it, exclude it. So there's no potential visibility or anybody else seeing data that they shouldn't. And then the other piece is pay finalizations. What elements of pay do and don't need to be fed from WFM? Not all pay scenarios necessarily need to be in WFM. Things like bonus payments and allowances are typically not in WFM. Best practices include only those items that are needed for gross pay calculations in WFM. So like the way I look at this is, what are all the elements that go into making up an employee's pay stub? Where do they need to come from? Obviously, a lot of it's going to come through WFM, through payroll, because on a pay week where they're just working, that's going to be the determiner of the hours that go into it. And then you may have a situation where some of the data is coming from WFM, but it's a bonus or an allowance that's being calculated in the payroll system that doesn't need to come from WFM. Or it could be a situation where an employee's on leave altogether and they don't get any hours coming out of WFM, and it's just all paid direct payroll system. So you have to consider that as well.
Good point. I just want to go back to a couple of things on this slide that you mentioned that I think it deserves a little bit more discussion. The discussion of having the rates in WFM or not, keep it outside, or whether you want to use the accruals in the WFM and make WFM the system of record for that. All of these, obviously, decisions have implications. And our job as your consulting partner is to make sure you fully understand the impact of your decisions and be able to help you with those decisions. So in case of, for example, if I guess on the project that you're on, right, Pete, we discussed that. Should we keep the employee accruals on the HR side and use the WFM only to take time off? And what happens in that case is that, well, there is a feed from HR to update the balances for the employees in WFM. As people take their time off on a week, on an open period week, the balance would be deducted in WFM, and a pay code for those balances will be sent to payroll. And then payroll will update HR with those codes, and the balances get updated in HR. So if you look at it this way, technically HR balances are usually 2 weeks behind, or if the pay period is 2 weeks. They are a pay period behind, right? And there is room for, but if, for example, if all the time off requests are accrued where they are taken, there's always real-time accuracy, right? And these are the decisions you need to make. Obviously, also that adds effort to the project because you already have in HR those things, configured. It's a trade-off, right? And we help you. And again, these are the things that we make sure that you fully understand the implications of these and come up with a recommendation that at the end is going to help us better understand what the best approach would be.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that can be on the complexity of your solution as well. Some areas may be better suited to do the type of, like with the current client I'm working on, the HR system is better suited to do. Yeah. So therefore it happens there. The trade-off is, as you say, they have a 2-week lag. Yeah, and you can put that in. Like we ended up having to put a when people don't necessarily have enough accrued, they can put a placeholder request out into the future to get around that. So there's creative ways of solving this, but really it comes down to meeting the business needs in the way possible.
Correct. Well, thank you for that. Let's take a deeper dive into data dependencies now.
Okay, sure. So with data dependencies, you're really talking about 3 things: the hierarchy, the employee data, and the financial data on data warehousing needs. So for hierarchy, this is about the reporting structure. Who needs the visibility to see report data in WFM? This is usually a blend of a day-to-day need and an overarching systemic visibility need from senior management. So you have to factor that in at that level. And then you also want to factor in the time approval structure. And this is what I was talking about earlier. Who approves the time cards? But who also can have visibility to time cards, but not necessarily need to approve them, but could potentially make updates to them. This is like a timekeeper role potentially, where somebody's coming in and actually filling out time cards for people or making adjustments based on things like that. So you may have a role like that that needs to see a larger group of employees and then a smaller subset that actually needs to approve those. So you have to look at the time approval structure as how that meets your organizational need. And then the security structure in general. And this is more who can see and do what within the system. This is ensuring really that your employee population is only relevant for the employees. The supervisors have all the tools and ability to see and do what they need to do to complete the approvals of time and get it ready for payroll processing. And then give your payroll folks the ability to finalize and transmit a payroll out of WFM into the downstream payroll system. I always kind of treat the WFM hierarchy like a folder structure in your Windows directories on your PC or on a server. That way you can limit access to who can see what folders and who can see what within the server data. It's essentially you're doing the same exercise with this.
And Pete, this also exists obviously on the HR side in some cases, right? A hierarchy or a structure in there that could potentially feed the WFM, but usually the meaning or the usage of the hierarchy or the definition of that in these two systems are different, which makes it very hard to map them correctly, right?
Correct. Yeah, and usually, like I said before, in the GHR system, the hierarchy is more based on position. So who's actually my reporting to boss? And
right.
If it's not the same thing, like who's making adjustments to my time, who's making approvals to my time, who needs to be able to see my time card may be completely different. And in a lot of ways, you have to divine that from the requirements based on the business need, and then pull the information you need out of the upstream system to get that wherever possible. And sometimes you end up where a system of record is actually for the hierarchy is in WFM, and then you run an export out of that as well. So it really depends on what your hierarchy needs for the business process to determine where the system of records for something like that is as well.
Got it.
And just moving along to the employee data then, this is things like labor metrics. What GL data can employee charge to? What cost centers they need to have access to? What jobs can they adjust to? This allows the employee the flexibility to choose and complete their time card in the most effective way without giving them an overabundance of data to choose from. They know I can either be a janitor or a retail associate or whatever specific task that they are qualified to do, and those are the only two jobs they can choose from, instead of having a list of all the jobs where they got to find the one that they're working on. So you really want to consider how your data dependencies to the employee, but also to unit go together there. Same thing with balances. Like I talked about before, which balances are relevant to which employee groups? Not every employee group is going to have PTO. They may call it vacation. So they don't need to see a PTO balance in WFM. They just need to see a vacation balance and vice versa. And then what other leave types do you need to charge to? A common example for that is things like bereavement. You may not have a bucket associated with it, but you may have logic and rules that you can't take 6 months of bereavement. You can only take 3 days. So you can put logic around using those types of things that don't have balances as well. And then you also want to think about things like skills, certifications, really, and this is for what is needed to schedule people in WFM. So a lot of times you may have, if you're using the multi-view scheduler, you have specific skills necessary for the job to be scheduled, and you need to have the information of what employees are qualified to do that. So you need to bring that data dependency in from somewhere else, like. And then basic information. What is needed for supervisors and managers to schedule employees and improve their time. You may also want to factor in what employee information is needed to calculate their time correctly as well here. So things like how many hours did they work in the previous calendar year maybe is needed to calculate their benefits accrual, or how many hours they're scheduled for in a week is used as threshold for their weekly overtime. things like that. So you may have to pull that data down as well. And really the best practice here is to only include what you need to schedule and calculate pay for employees. And you really always need to be mindful of what data privacy concerns need to be considered. There's usually state, federal, or if you're dealing with the EU, you've got a whole bunch of obligations for data privacy that need to be considered here. And you really need to be factoring that in so that you're not in violation of any of that as well. And then when you get into financial and data warehouse, it's really about the downstream system. Do you need to do billing out of that? Is probably the most common one. And that's the one I'm dealing with right now. So what GL accounts need to be available to employees to charge their time correctly? And so that they're ensuring that they're not just putting it against some bucket GL code, and then you have to go back in and massage the data after the fact. Make sure the employees are charging. If it needs to be billed to client X, they're charging to the GL account for that. And this really is allowing for your WFM system to ensure the correct accounting of your labor costs. This is similar to cost centers. Do you need to account for separate cost centers when capturing time across your organization? If somebody moves from one location to another, do the charge change? And for things like projects, do you have special projects? Usually the best example of a special project that you're dealing with is the project that I'm working on. Somebody's got a specific project that they need to charge their time when they're counting this. So obviously you're not going to bootstrap the WFM system to do it that way. But when you go to do another project for another system, you've got the flexibility to charge to special projects as needed. And then for external data, you want to be considering things like what needs to come out of Infor WFM to go into things like a data warehouse. Do you have to capture X amount of data in your data warehouse that is just a straight output of your payroll from the last 2 years? You've got to have that raw data in your data warehouse. You want to take into account those data warehousing concerns at this point as well. And I think the key here is the best practice is to only track and allow changes that data needs to be associated with labor costs. There's no need to have extraneous data in WFM if the supervisor or employee can't change it.
Well, that's great. Just one thing that kind of came to my mind as you were talking about this, for example, let's take just skills and certifications. On our current project on State of New Hampshire, where we're actually implementing this, the skills and certifications don't exist anywhere, right? So the key is find out, okay, this is the data that I need in the WFM. Where do I get it from? What is the dependency on the other ones? If HR doesn't have it today, where can I get that from? And if it doesn't have really a system of record anywhere, the decision becomes, okay, maybe it makes sense to add this to the HR system in the employee profile, flow that over to WFM and use it that way. That way they can maintain it in HR because certifications need to be maintained, right? Or the other option was that, okay, we make the WFM system the system of record. We do a one-time load for all the certifications, and we know that the managers will be managing those certifications in the WFM. So decisions of this sort can early enough can define what the path should be. And if there are added components that, for example, HR never accounted for, okay, we got to now put in the skills in here, right, in the HR system. At least those discussions are held at the beginning and expectations are set.
For sure. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think in general, system of record is key to determine. Does it? Right. Who else needs to see this data besides WFM? If it's only WFM, yeah, make WFM the system of record. But if it's something that needs to be managed by a different process in a different system, for whatever reason, make the upstream system and have it flow into WFM and this is, like you said, dependent on your specific scenario as much as anything.
So thank you, Pete, for all the insight. We only have a minute left. I want to make sure that if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach us. Our email addresses are down in here, Pete and myself. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions. We'll be happy to help you.